Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Mr. White here with a short presentation for you all about something called fiscal policy, okay? Fiscal policy simply means the way that the government spends money to try to help stabilize the economy when the economy fluctuates. And we talk about economic fluctuation, we're talking about expansions or contractions of the business cycle. Okay, so first off, guys, like I said, fiscal policy is just government efforts to promote full employment and price stability by changing government spending and or taxes, okay? So if we're in a recession, we would counter that with what's known as expansionary policy. During expansionary policy, we would increase government spending and decrease taxes. Now, inflation, which is the big problem when we're expanding, is countered by contractionary fiscal policy. This is where we would decrease government spending and increase taxes. Now, both of these actions are aimed at either increasing or decreasing the growth of our GDP. If we're in a contraction, obviously we need to increase the growth of our GDP, and so that's why we would increase government spending, because we know government spending is one of the components of GDP, and we'll decrease taxes, because decreasing taxes will help increase more business investment and especially consumption. That's a big deal. Now, if we're in an expansion phase, you might say, why would we want to slow down? Well, the problem is we don't want our economy to grow too quickly because we might find ourselves in a situation where the growth is uncontrolled. And of course, you know, the farther you go up, the farther you can go down. So of course, the government wants to keep the growth at a slow and steady pace, and we want to fight against inflation because we know inflation is bad for the value of our money. So the government will stop spending so much, and that'll slow down the growth of government spending in the GDP formula, and they'll also increase taxes, which will slow down business investment and consumer spending. Now, expansionary fiscal policy means when we're trying to stop a recession, we got to get the economy to expand again. You know, the problem with the recession is we're in that contraction phase. So we're trying to move out of a contraction phase and into an expansion phase. That's when we use that expansionary policy. So if government spending increases and taxes decrease, our aggregate demand will shift to the right. That's going to cause our price level to rise, and our real GDP is going to rise as well, which will cause our unemployment rate to fall. Of course, we know one of the worst things about a recession is that we have a high unemployment rate. So you'll notice that the price level increased. Now, this is what we would call a trade-off. Of course, we know that everybody has to face trade-offs in the economy because nobody can ever have everything they want all the time. So when we pursue an expansionary fiscal policy, we're going to create some inflation in the economy. And so that's why it's something that you have to be very careful about. The government shouldn't just use expansionary fiscal policy willy-nilly, as they say. Now, this is what it would look like on our aggregate model. Okay, as you can see here, we're in what's known as a recessionary gap, where our output, Y, is below our expected output. See, the actual output is lower. And in this situation, what we need to do is we need to get our government spending up, and we also need to cut taxes. So when we do that, it's going to increase our real GDP, because of course what's going to happen is our consumer spending is going to go up, and of course our government spending is going to go up. And so that's why we have our aggregate demand shifting to the right. That's going to bring us back to LRAS, and it's going to do it at a higher price level. So we'll be producing more people will have jobs, but things are going to be getting a little bit more expensive, which is exactly what we would expect as the unemployment rate falls. Oh, and by the way, I should probably tell you pi percent means inflation. Pi percent in economics is shorthand for inflation. Okay, so if we're in a contraction phase, we want to use expansionary policy, but when we're in an expansion phase, we use what's called contractionary policy. This is what we do to slow down the rate of inflation and to keep the growth rate of our economy under control. Okay, so it's easy to remember if you just know that the policy we use is always the opposite of what part of the business cycle we're in. If we're in the expansion phase, we use contractionary policy, and when we're in the contraction phase, we use expansionary policy. So with contractionary fiscal policy, government spending is going to fall and taxes are going to rise. That's going to shift our AD to the left. It's going to cause our price level to fall, so inflation will come down, which is exactly what we're going for. But our real GDP is going to fall, and that's going to cause our unemployment rate to rise. So once again, we have a trade-off. The trade-off here is that to decrease our inflation rate, we're going to have to increase our unemployment rate. Now, contractionary fiscal policy looks like this on our aggregate model. So you can see that we've been overproducing, right? We're overextended as an economy. Our actual output, Y, is greater than our normal or expected output, which is YF. So right now our unemployment rate is lower than it should be, and that's what's causing prices to be too high. So when government spending is going to go down, our aggregate demand would shift to the left. Okay, we could also do this with increasing our taxes, right? When we increase our taxes, then investment goes down, consumption goes down, and that would also shift our aggregate demand to the left. When our aggregate demand shifted to the left, that brought us back to our long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, but you'll notice the price level fell and the output fell. So we're not going to make as much stuff, but things are going to get cheaper and we're going to fight against that excess inflation. So one thing you should know is that when it comes to the government, there are some things they do that are expansionary, contractionary, that are just automatic. They just happen without anybody making a decision. But there are other things that they actually have to vote and pass a law and decide to do. So this is where we get into what's known as discretionary and automatic fiscal policies. Now, discretionary means that they have a choice. Government has to pass a law. They have to vote and debate. So discretionary fiscal policy is hard. This is when increasing or decreasing government spending and taxes will return the economy back to full employment, but we have to pass a law to make this happen. An example of that could be something like how much we spend on the military or how much we spend on education. Now, automatic fiscal policy is different. Automatic fiscal policy is something that just happens, it's something to do with a law that was already passed, probably sometime in previous years, and it would be something that would just automatically stimulate the economy or slow the economy down depending on what's happening. So let me give you a good example here. Unemployment insurance or unemployment compensation. That's something that will increase whenever the economy is doing poorly. When we have more cyclical unemployment, more people will apply for unemployment insurance, and automatically the government will spend more on unemployment insurance. Something else that works like that is a progressive tax rate. You see, with a progressive tax rate, the more money you make, the higher percentage you owe to the government in taxes. The less money you make, the lower percentage you owe in taxes. So that would be an example of taxes that automatically adjust depending on how the economy is doing. When the economy is doing well, everybody's income's going up, and so the government will collect more in taxes. When the economy is doing poorly, everybody's making less money, and so the government automatically takes in less money in taxes. And you see how that would be an automatic expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. And the beauty of that is the government doesn't have to pass any law because the law was already passed a long time ago. So remember that discretionary just means that they have to make a decision, like how much to spend on education or on military this year. But when it comes to automatic, it's something that just automatically changes government spending depending on how the economy is doing, like unemployment insurance or like taxes, progressive taxes. All right, now, the weakness of fiscal policy. Now, especially when it comes to discretionary fiscal policy, there can be a big lag. Lag means it takes a while before the policy actually takes effect and helps the economy. Inside lag means it takes a lot of time for the government to actually recognize that there's even a problem and then find a solution. And then the outside lag means that once they have a solution, it takes time to implement the solution. Now, of course, in today's modern society, another problem is political motivation. Politicians are always thinking about getting reelected, and they're more likely to support an expansionary rather than a contractionary fiscal policy. So sometimes that means that we're going to be doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. Like when the economy is expanding, if we cut taxes further, that's just going to accelerate our inflation rate. It's not actually going to slow down inflation rate. So increased government spending and decreased taxes are almost always more popular with voters. And that's why, unfortunately, even when we shouldn't be doing that, we do it anyways. Now, expansionary fiscal policy has another side effect, or I don't know if you can think of those other things as a side effect, but here's one side effect, we should say, maybe an unintended consequence of expansionary fiscal policy. Of course, expansionary fiscal policy is designed to try to get our GDP growing when we're in a slump. But sometimes if the government borrows too much money to be able to do more government programs and provide more services to the people, it'll actually crowd out private investment. So this is what happens. When government spending rises or when taxes fall, the government has to borrow money in order to continue spending. This leads to a big increase in demand for loans, or what we call loanable funds. So in other words, the government starts asking for money, more loans. This will decrease the supply of loans, which results in an interest rate increase. Now, see, R% means interest rate, the real interest rate, I should say. This change in the real interest rate leads to a decline in gross business investment. In addition, the increase in the real interest rate causes the value of the dollar to increase, or it would also cause our savings to decrease because investors are going to seek higher returns in the US. Now this leads to an increase in the value of the dollar. That'll cause our exports to fall and our imports will rise. So our net exports goes down. And because of this, the loss of investment and net exports, they're direct components of our aggregate demand. This is going to offset some of the increases in aggregate demand that we would get from more government spending. Whew. That's a long explanation, but basically just think of it this way. It's kind of like trying to drive really fast with the brakes on, right? If you push on the gas and the brakes at the same time, you might go forward, but you're definitely not going to go forward as fast as you should be going because you're slowing yourself down. Now, the government slows the economy down when they borrow too much money and they make the interest rates too high because that creates problems for exports and for business investment. And so that's what we mean by crowding out. Okay, so this is what crowding out looks like on a graph. We're going to actually look at two new graphs here that you really haven't learned yet. We're going to learn them in the next unit, but let me just give you a brief rundown. On the left, we've got what's called the loanable funds model. This shows the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds. That's what SLF and DLF stands for. On our y-axis, we've got the real interest rate, and on our x-axis, we've got the quantity of loanable funds. Like in other words, how much money is available to be loaned out. Now, over on the right, this is what we would call the investment demand model. It shows the demand for business investment, see ID right there, and on our y-axis we've got the real interest rate, on our x-axis we've got the quantity of business investment. Okay, so when our real interest rate is here, so we can just call this like our starting real interest rate, the quantity of loanable funds is at equilibrium and business investment is at point I. Now, if there was going to be more government borrowing, our demand for loanable funds will increase, right? Because the government is demanding more loans. When the government demands more loans, we can see what happens. Our real interest rate rises. Now, when the real interest rate rises and the quantity of loans goes up, we're going to notice that the quantity of business investment goes down. The reason why is because businesses, of course, don't want to borrow money if the interest rate's too high, because all the interest that they pay cuts into their profits. And so this is why if the government borrows too much, they're actually going to slow down economic growth somewhat because of the fact that they're going to have less business investment and also, most likely, lower net exports. Okay, so increasing government spending and or decreasing taxes, the government will have some deficit spending, meaning they're going to have to borrow. The demand for loans increases, the real interest rate increases, and business investment decreases. That's crowding out. So, contractionary fiscal policy has a side effect called crowding in of investment and net exports. So a possible side effect of decreased government spending and increased taxes is what we call a budget surplus, meaning extra money left over. It sounds good, but it may lead to crowding in of gross private investment and net exports. It's kind of the exact opposite of what happens with crowding out. So when government spending falls or taxes rise, the government develops a budget surplus, meaning like the government will have extra money left over. Yay! This leads to a decrease in the demand for loanable funds, right? So the decreased demand for loanable funds and an increase in the supply of loanable funds results in a drop in the real interest rate. Interest goes down. This change in the interest rate leads to an increase in business investment. So businesses are going to go out, they're going to build new factories, they're going to hire people, create jobs. That's good, right? In addition, this decrease in the real interest rate causes our money demand to fall, and people are going to save more money because, you know, when you can see a benefit to have higher returns abroad, you're going to put your money in banks somewhere else because you're not getting a high enough interest rate here in the United States. Now, this leads to a decrease in the value of the dollar. And when the dollar goes down, exports go up, imports go down, net exports increases, and because of that, business investment and net exports are components of AD. That would offset some of the decrease in aggregate demand from the government cutting back their spending. So even when the government cuts spending or increases taxes, it's not going to slow the economy down as much as they might. All right, and so last but not least, we've been talking about Congress increasing taxes or decreasing taxes, and just like how we have a spending multiplier, we actually have a tax multiplier. So when the government is trying to figure out if they should raise or lower taxes, they can actually do a sort of a rough calculation of how much an increase or decrease would impact real GDP with something called the tax multiplier. So the tax multiplier is the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, divided by the MPS times the change in taxes. So for example, if our MPC was something like, let me get my little marker here, let's say our MPC was 0.8. Ooh, that looks good. Divided by 0.2. Ooh, that's working. Okay, well, this is not beautiful, guys, but you just have to roll with it. Okay, so 8 divided by 2 is 4. Ooh, there we go. Cool. And so then you would just multiply that times whatever the change in taxes is. So if we cut taxes by $100 billion, we would multiply it by 100 billion. Okay, and that would give us a 400 billion increase of our real GDP. All right. And that's pretty much it, guys. So I know that's not pretty, but hopefully you can kind of tell what this says. Okay, there's 400 billion. All right, beautiful. So that's it. Hopefully this was helpful. If not, ask me questions in class, and I'll see you next time.